Hello class, this is a response to your first reading in Kevin Corcoran's book, Rethinking Human Nature. I want to talk a little bit about some of the prompts that I asked, hopefully go into a little bit more detail. If you haven't been listening to my video lectures, I strongly encourage you to do that, both regarding the video of me going over the syllabus, the video of me going over cap paper expectations, introducing the course, as well as my sort of the lectures related to week 1 and now week 2. Those will be very helpful. Again, they're not a replacement for the reading. You really need to do the reading, but hopefully they'll provide a supplement. And then these responses are, I've read the reflections, and now I'm going to sort of talk about a few more issues, things that were brought up in some of the reflections, hopefully provide some clarity. One of the first prompts was related to Kevin Corcoran and his notion that, right, as a Christian philosopher, he's going to start with a certain set of beliefs. One might call them assumptions, like in philosophy we might say he's starting from a certain set of assumptions related to Christianity and faith. He says he wants to hold to the historical creeds. He lays them out. He doesn't talk about all the creeds, but he tries to lay out the ones he thinks are important. A triune God, Jesus being both human and divine, dying and being raised again, Jesus' second coming, that we will in essence be raised with Christ in the eschaton, the virgin birth. So he lists several of these creeds as being foundational to what it means to be Christian. And this is not just his view, but this is, right, a 2,000 and some odd year process in the making where these creeds have been affirmed and they have formed the identity of the Christian church in its various denominations and forms. But this core is essential. To deny these beliefs is not necessarily to deny one's salvation, but certainly it is to place one outside of a Christian context. You're doing something else now, right? Christianity is no longer your in-group if you're denying these essential claims. And so he starts with that, these set of assumptions, these set of faith claims, this core, and then begins to use philosophical tools, argumentation, evidence, reason, and logic to sort of build off of them, moving in various directions. And he thinks, as a Christian philosopher, this is what he ought to do something differently, especially to do something in a way that leads one away from the creeds. Maybe he'd still be doing philosophy. He'd be doing secular philosophy. Maybe you could do Buddhist philosophy. Maybe you could do some other kind of philosophy. But to do Christian philosophy is to embrace these and then move outward. Now, that's not to say we can't question that core. We certainly can. But if you're led to deny the core and you're outside the Christian faith, then you're not doing Christian philosophy, you're doing some other kind of philosophy. So I don't think he's opposed to questioning the core. And certainly he says, as, right, these circles, we move from the core to sort of more peripheral beliefs within the Christian tradition. Now we really have an obligation as Christians to think through these, because he thinks several of those have been shown to be false, and we should deny them with fear and trembling. In fact, he's essentially setting up the argument for the book. The book wants to deny dualism, which has been a very traditional Christian belief. I am a body and a soul. My body will die and become dust. My soul will float off to heaven and exist eternally with God. He thinks that kind of separation, that dualism, is not true. The evidence and the arguments do not support it as strongly as a different view, which he's going to give you in the readings to come. But since it's a traditional Christian view, he has to give you good reasons why you ought to reject it and embrace his own view. But since it's not central to the Christian core, he's perfectly justified in doing this as a Christian philosopher. And that's sort of his strategy as he introduces the text. But he raises some important issues that I want to talk about. And some of these issues are related to faith and reason. And this is a real struggle, a real dialogue. For me, it's almost a battle sometimes. How do I reconcile faith and reason? And with reason, I include evidence, empirical data, science, the tangible world. Faith is more like revelation, religious experience, various faith claims, things that are often intangible or very personal, where I can't show anybody else and say, see, look at the data or something. So you've got these two worlds. But I'm an academic, and I'm a philosopher, and I care very deeply about science. So I exist in the world of reason and empirical data and argument. But I'm also a Christian, and I am a man of faith. And so these two worlds, how do I blend them together? Do they collide? Right? Or do they fit nicely? And that's a difficult thing. And I think Kevin Corcoran, whether he wants to or not, begins to bring some of these issues up. We have various ways of looking at this. One way of thinking about faith and reason is to say, well, for the most part, they're in harmony. For the most part, they support one another. But when there's disagreement, when the two disagree, we ought to embrace reason and evidence and change our faith in light of it. Right? That's one way of thinking about the relationship. They go together for the most part. But when there's a conflict, we go with reason. And I'll give an example. Many people read Genesis 1 through 3 literally. And they say this is a historical account of the beginnings of the earth, 7 literal days, 2 literal people, Adam and Eve, as the first parents, a literal fall after eating the fruit. Because of their fall, the world now is broken. We have death and disease and natural disasters. God is now working to take this fallen humanity because of the fall and bring it to redemption. There was a literal snake. God literally walked in the garden, and this is a historical account. Now, this is faith because it's predicated on a faith claim that says the Bible is the inerrant word of God and was written essentially as God wanted it to be written. Those things cannot be proven, but instead one says, as a Christian, I believe them on faith. Now, though, there's a lot of really good evidence to support that the earth is very old, that the universe is very old. Each science individually supports an old earth. Whether it's astronomy and the amount of time it takes light to reach Earth from outer space, millions and millions of years, whether it's geology, whether it's chemistry and the rate of decay of carbon, whether it's biology and the diversity of the gene pool and how long that would take, how many generations. And there's all kinds of evidence from these various sciences that say the Earth's a lot older than 6,000 or 7,000 years. We can even date trees to like 12,000 years. We can date ice caps. We can drill down, right, into them and get back 15,000 years. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Earth's very old. Well, what happens now? What wins? Should my interpretation of Genesis, my faith in the inerrancy of Scripture, change in light of this evidence? Or should I reject the evidence in light of my faith? Right? Do I trust good argument, tangible data, or am I going to hold on to this? Is this a core element of my faith? That if I lose it, I cease to be Christian or something? Like, how do I navigate that? Even further, I personally think there's really good evidence to support evolution. So I've been convinced. And yet I'm still a Christian. The evidence has forced me to re-understand Genesis 1 through 3. I understand it as a theological allegory that is profoundly true. True, telling us about human nature. True, communicating the relationship between humans and God. True, related to our human sin and temptation. True, in terms of how we're created in the image of God. So much of it I see as true, just not historical. Informative of the Christian narrative and the Christian message, but not scientific. So I've shaped my faith around what I consider to be good arguments and good evidence, but I don't really consider that to be a core of the Christian faith, right? It's just a way of looking at the first 3 chapters of Genesis. So I've chosen to have that relationship look a certain way. Other Christians would say absolutely not. Faith always trumps reason if the two conflict. And that's another way of looking at it, right? The second relationship. Faith and reason, maybe they go along with each other for the most part, but when they conflict, I go with faith, I deny the arguments and the evidence and whatnot. That's another way of looking at it. Now, the issue with, there's issues with both views. If you let evidence trump faith, what else will be lost along the way? It starts in Genesis, but where does it end? And I think that some Christians fear. If good arguments and science and philosophy push and push and push, what happens to our faith? Of course, the other problem is that if we let faith trump good evidence, do I get to believe anything I want? Well, I believe these things on faith, and I don't care what the evidence says. I don't care what arguments you give me. I just can believe what I want to believe. Does that allow people, again, to believe whatever they want? On what grounds could we look at someone who's not a Christian and say, well, you believe the wrong things? Because they'll just say, well, that's my faith. And you try to give them arguments, you try to point to Scripture. Oh, that's really nice, but I don't believe in good arguments or evidence. That doesn't convince me. I just have my faith. So how do we balance these two things out? And Corcoran is getting to this somewhat, right? The Christian philosopher deals with it daily, this tension of which wins out in the end. Of course, a third view might be something like faith and reason are always in harmony, that they never conflict with one another. That if we use reason properly, if we look at the evidence in the right light, then it will support our faith and the creeds, and there won't be conflict. I have my doubts about that, but there are some that would suggest that the two are always compatible and we don't run into problems. So, there are some philosophers who suggest that philosophy should start with no assumptions. Philosophy should start with no sort of baggage, and that it should implement reason, like we covered in the first week. It should implement good rules of argumentation. It should implement evidence and empirical data. And philosophy is here just to sort of unpack that and lead where, just sort of follow where those things lead us, and we'll eventually arrive at the truth. Right? That's the path of philosophy. Remove biases and assumptions. Remove any foundations of faith. Let reason, argumentation, and data drive it. Now, in this case, I think if we look at philosophy in that way, there's going to be some real problems when it comes to Christianity. For instance, most core Christian doctrines seem irrational. They seem to go against reason in many respects. Jesus was raised from the dead, as an example, the resurrection, kind of a core Christian doctrine. But if we look at philosophy in this way that I've been describing, assumptionless, just follow the evidence and the good argumentation, you can hear the reply, well, human history has been ongoing for, at least thousands of years. No human I know, my personal experience included, has seen anyone being raised from the dead. Thousands of people will die today, none will be raised from the dead. Thousands of people died yesterday, none were raised from the dead. And so on and so forth, back through history. That seems to be a pretty strong inductive argument that Jesus probably wasn't raised from the dead, because humans don't do that, right? And so, if I'm just following argumentation and evidence, the resurrection looks very improbable. So to believe it seems irrational. It would be like someone saying, well, I believe in unicorns. And then I say, well, no one's ever seen a unicorn. And then you say, oh, I know, because they're really private. No one's really ever seen it, but just trust me, I have faith that there are unicorns. A philosopher's going to say, yeah, that's weird. You shouldn't believe that. Unless you can give me good reasons. Right? So do I hear any good arguments or any evidence at all for the resurrection other than faith? Okay, then we shouldn't believe it. The philosopher in this view that's here on the screen, right here, would also look at the virgin birth. Yeah, don't know any way you can sort of thwart biology. We've got pretty good knowledge of the biological process and how babies are made, and we have no evidence of any virgin births in our lifetime or in the lifetimes past. you have any good arguments or evidence for Jesus' virgin birth, then you shouldn't believe it, right? Divine and human, two natures in one. Jesus, the Son of God, but clearly God has never had sex. There's no female counterpart, so how can Jesus be a son? What does that even mean? Let alone a human being with a divine nature. So you get the point. These things seem to be predicated on faith. A philosopher who starts with no presuppositions is going to have a hard time accepting that because they look irrational, right? And I think this is why many people say, well, philosophy is against Christianity. Philosophy is against faith. Philosophy is against religion. In this context, it could be, because it's hard to make solid philosophical arguments supporting these doctrines. Kevin Corcoran says, I start there. I start with that as part of my faith, and philosophy is an outward movement from that foundation. But Corcoran's going to say something else, and I think this is true, and if it's true, then philosophy might not be counterproductive to faith. Corcoran's going to say all worldviews start with a certain set of assumptions. All worldviews have a foundation of presuppositions that go unproven. You have to start somewhere. Whatever your worldview happens to be, you've got to start somewhere. And there's got to be a foundation of things that you don't question, that you think are true, and that you move from those out to the world. You move from that foundation out to other arguments and other claims that you are trying to prove. If I'm a scientist, then I assume that my sense experience gives me accurate information about the world. I can't prove that. I assume it, right? It's possible that I live in the Matrix and that what I'm seeing is an illusion. Many Buddhists believe this. That's possible. Scientists essentially say, well, that's false. Sense experience gives us accurate information about the world. Scientists assume the future will be like the past, and I can make inductive arguments to move into the future as though it will be like the past. In the past, this is where the kidneys are. In the past, this is where the heart has been and the lungs have been, and we assume this next person and it will be very similar to the past. But we never know if the future will be like the past. But we make certain assumptions that that's the case, and they're usually pretty good assumptions. Scientists assume certain things about empirical data, right? And the natural world and natural laws and how consistent they are. But many of those assumptions cannot be proven. They have to be assumed, and then from those assumptions, we develop models. We develop arguments. We try to confirm those arguments through experiment. But you get the point, right? Theology, whether it's Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, starts with certain assumptions, and then theologians make arguments from those assumptions about other things, like God is love. We believe this because it's in Scripture, predicated on faith. If God is love, then God would act in certain ways that are loving. That's an argument that's trying to be consistent with God's nature that starts from a place of faith. Corcoran's point is essentially all arguments start with certain assumptions, certain faith claims that are unprovable or unproven, and that you can't avoid that. Justification and argumentation comes to an end somewhere. That's your foundation. Those things typically cannot be proven. He simply says, as a Christian, my foundation is a Christian foundation. Creeds, orthodoxy based on church history, right? Communal discernment. From that foundation, he's going to make philosophical arguments about the nature of the human person, the nature of the afterlife. He's going to make certain ethical arguments. But they don't come from nowhere. They stem from a particular foundation that makes him a Christian philosopher, not an atheist philosopher, or a Buddhist philosopher, or a Confucius philosopher. But he thinks all philosophers start somewhere and come from a particular foundation, and I think that's true. So if that's the case, then I think he's okay, right? Starting here. All right. Again, some would argue that no matter what assumptions you start with, faith and reason, if used properly, will fit and ultimately lead one to the Christian faith. Again, I have my doubts. If a person starts with the assumption that empirical data gives us ultimate truth, I don't know how they're going to accept the resurrection. If the only truth is that which can be verified, then I don't know how that person starting from that foundation can accept the virgin birth. But why should a person believe that the only truth that exists is that which that can be empirically verified, right? Why is that our assumption, that the only truth is that which can be empirically verified? Why couldn't we say some truth can be empirically verified, another truth can't be, right? Isn't that okay too? If so, then maybe Corcoran's got a foundation to start from. I hope this is helping some. I want to move now to the second set of prompts dealing with the two types of dualism, and I want to try to make this relevant for you in some way. I'm going to highlight the differences. Substance dualism is the dualism advocated by Descartes. You've got the three main arguments, the argument from doubt, divisibility, separability. If you don't know those arguments by now, you need to go back, listen to my lecture, do the reading. In the end, Descartes tried to make an argument that you have two complete substances. You have a body, you have a soul. You have a physical element, you have a non-physical element. These two are complete in themselves. The human person is this body that has a soul connected to it. Upon death, the body will die. The soul, in its complete form, will go and live in eternity with God. This is about life after death. The soul is the mind. It's that thing that thinks. It's our memory. It's our personality. It's our ethics. It's who we are, fundamentally, our identity. That will exist in the afterlife. The body is just the machine that houses the soul. The body will perish and disintegrate. Two complete substances interacting with each other. Minds influencing bodies, bodies influencing minds. For Descartes, this is clear because animals are bodies. But animals do not have minds. Animals do not have souls, according to Descartes. But yet they're alive, they feel pain, they do a bunch of other things, right? And so bodies are complete in themselves. The human person has this eternal element that can think, reason, be moral, and that is eternal, that animals don't have. So we have these two complete substances. This is very similar to Gnosticism, if you remember this. Gnostics were substance dualists. The body is evil, totally depraved. The soul, the eternal element, the non-physical element is good. We are here to deny our bodies, to remove ourselves from our bodies, and to live into our souls and then into the afterlife. As a result, Gnostics denied that Jesus had a real body. Jesus couldn't have a real body because the body is evil and Jesus is sinless. So he had to have an ethereal body. They emphasized the virgin birth as a result. Jesus could not be the product of bodily sex, but instead was a very separate kind of entity, fully divine and perfect in every way. This has, I think, been a kind of danger within Christianity, this kind of dualism. This world is bad, this world is perishing, the physical is evil, and instead the goal of Christianity is essentially to get my soul saved so that when I die, my soul floats off to heaven and I'm in paradise, right? Gnosticism is kind of an extreme form of that, but I think many Christian traditions have sort of latched on. He then contrasts this with Aquinas' view, which is compound dualism. Aquinas says, yes, we have a soul, a spirit, a non-physical thing, and a body. The two things are incomplete, though. A human person comes from these two incomplete substances being joined, combined together to form a full person, right? I am not simply my soul, the way Descartes would say my identity is wrapped up in my soul. I am both a soul and a body, and you cannot separate the two. So Aquinas has a more embodied view of the human person, which I find very interesting and important. I think it avoids some of those dangers of dualism. And yet, what about an afterlife? How does that look? If my body's in the ground decaying, and my soul is incomplete without the body, does the soul remain incomplete in the afterlife? Descartes does not have that problem. Aquinas does. How do we address that? Corcoran is going to address some of that in chapter 3, and we'll get there. But hopefully that helps you identify the major difference between Descartes and Aquinas. There are problems. Both of them care about the afterlife, and I think also both of them care about how the view of the human person affects ethics, the normative realm. Descartes, his view has some serious ethical implications. For instance, he thinks humans are thinking things, other material beings are non-thinking things, whether it's animals or nature. We're fundamentally set apart and have a divine nature that is our souls that floats off. As a result, Christians, this is one influence among many, but as a result, Christians have tended to look at animals as though they're here to serve us. If we want to eat them, kill them, right, use them as we see fit, we're set apart. This dualism. I think that's led to some real problems, right, with conservation and with species going extinct and with wholesale slaughter for ivory or what, you name it. But you can see how this view can lead to ethical problems. Same thing with the natural world. Nature has been abused in many respects, not tended or cared for. And I think sometimes the separation is part of the problem. But if we have an embodied sense of the human person, we are essentially nature. Part of us is the natural world, the dust that we've been created from. So what happens to the natural world, we're actually doing to part of ourselves. That kind of relationship means we probably treat nature differently, animals differently, other things. But maybe Descartes is right, and there is a fundamental separation. Maybe Aquinas is right and there's not. But I want you to see that how you view the human person has ethical ramifications, and we're going to get there at the end of this book regarding stem cell research and other issues like that, which should be very interesting, how we view the human person. But I think you can start to speculate a little bit. If I have this soul, right, that connects to my body, then it's conceivable to say that as soon as my body comes into existence, as soon as the sperm and the egg unite, boom, here comes the soul. And if who I am is fundamentally that soul, then any abortion is going to be wrong, because who I am it already comes into existence with the soul. But if I'm primarily a physical thing that's in development, and my identity is tied up in that, then you might have a different take on the abortion issue. So what the essence of human nature, do we have a soul or not, has wide-reaching ethical ramifications. Euthanasia. If this body and this brain that's decaying has a soul, well then we have to keep it alive no matter what. But if it's just the body and the brain is essentially dead and that's really what your mind is, then maybe pulling the plug's okay. You get the idea, right? There's real importance here within this debate. I hope this helps and is interesting to you. If you have any questions at all, let me know, and I hope to see you online.